welcome. You're likely here because you want to, well, cut through the noise.
Mm-hmm.
You want to understand these big, complicated questions, like the one we're tackling today, without getting lost in just endless information.
Absolutely.
Today, we're digging into something pretty heavy. The possibility of a third world war. We've got a recent analysis, some expert viewpoints.
Right.
And our mission really is just to distill the core arguments, the evidence, so you get a clear picture of what's actually being said.
And what's interesting right away is that this isn't just, abstract thinking.
No.
There's a definite thread in some of these analyses connecting the war in Ukraine to historical patterns, things we saw before World War I, before World War II.
That's quite a parallel. Sobering, as you said.
It is. Not saying it's a direct repeat, of course, but you see these echoes, how huge conflicts can sometimes bubble up.
And it feels like more than just history repeating, doesn't it? That whole sense of global cooperation, the Davos spirit, someone called it.
Yeah, that seems to be fading fast.
Definitely fracturing. I saw an advisor to Rishi Sunak recently talking about a shift, a move towards more open competition.
Mm-hmm.
And what really struck me was the sheer number of potential hotspots all simmering at once. Ukraine, obviously, but also the South China Sea, the Indo-Pacific, parts of Europe, even the Arctic.
It paints a picture of really widespread tension. Interconnected tension.
Yeah.
And if you look back, say, a year or so, a Bloomberg analysis actually argued that the Ukraine war had already, in a way, hit a World War III level.
In terms of its global impact.
Exactly. Global repercussions, the escalation they've seen just in the previous, 16 months or so?
Yeah.
It shows how seriously some were taking the implications even back then.
Okay, now, something that really jumped out at me from our sources is this classified Spanish government report. 1,000 pages.
Operation Mancha, yeah. Sounds like something from a spy thriller, doesn't it?
It really does, and the conclusions are unsettling.
Very. The report apparently found that the world's geopolitical systems, the energy infrastructure, it's all surprisingly fragile, vulnerable.
So not just one regional issue, but a kind of systemic weakness.
That seems to be the assessment, yeah. Which could have these huge, far-reaching consequences.
And the report gets specific about Europe, right? I mean, 800,000 German troops potentially deployed. NATO northern flank against Russia, that's a massive number.
It is. The sheer scale the Spanish report is talking about a major conventional war in Europe, potentially like World War II in scale.
Wow.
It really tells you the level of concern within, well, at least some government circles.
And it suggests Europe is already moving down that path, rearming.
That's what the report says, yes. Actively preparing for what they seem to view as a pretty significant conflict.
So, according to this report, at least, the path towards a big war in Europe is almost locked in. That sounds incredibly pessimistic.
The report suggests, well, in the short term, it might be hard to change course, largely because the Ukraine conflict is so intense, and there's this perception of Russian inflexibility. And maybe the most alarming bit in Operation Mancha is where it considers Russia possibly using a tactical nuclear weapon.
If they felt like they were losing conventionally.
Exactly. If faced with imminent conventional defeat.
Right.
It just highlights the incredibly high stakes right now.
That is. Yeah, that's chilling. Okay, shifting from that classified document to maybe broader expert views, what are the general predictions out there among the people who study this stuff full-time?
That's the key question, isn't it? What do the specialists think? Well, there was a YouGov survey.
Oh, yeah.
And it found that 53%, so over half of international relations experts and strategic analysts believe a third world war is likely within the next 10 years.
53%. That's a majority. That's striking. Why do you think it's so high? Is it just Ukraine or?
It's likely a combination of factors we've touched on. And it's not just one survey saying this either.
No, I saw something from the Atlantic Council, too.
Right, they did a strategy paper. Similar concerns. Around 40% of the global strategists and scholars they talk to predict a new major war between great powers by 2035.
40% by 2035. And they're not thinking of just one localized conflict.
No, their analysis points more towards a multi-theater situation. Maybe Europe and the Indo-Pacific.
Driven by?
Well, the things we've discussed. Ukraine tensions, obviously.
Yeah.
The potential for conflict over Taiwan, the South China Sea stuff, and this growing strategic alignment or perceived alignment between China, Russia, and North Korea.
It's like several different fuses burning at once.
Well, it feels that way, yeah. A confluence of major global pressure points.
And you mentioned Taiwan there. That issue just keeps cropping up again and again. Why is that situation considered so particularly volatile?
It really does. The Economist, Back in early 2023, they basically underlined a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan as just one of the most dangerous triggers imaginable.
For a global conflict.
Yes, because the economic ripple effects, the military ones, they would just be immense, far-reaching. It wouldn't just be about China and Taiwan. The global fallout would be profound.
But, okay, it's important to say not everyone thinks World War III is just around the corner, right? There are defense experts pushing back a bit.
Absolutely. And that's crucial for a balanced view here. Plenty of defense experts argue that, yes, things are risky, undeniably risky. But a full-scale global war involving the major nuclear powers isn't necessarily inevitable in the next, say, 5 years.
So the future isn't set in stone. What factors might prevent that kind of massive escalation, in their view?
Well, one argument is about distinguishing the current conflicts. So Ukraine, for instance. Devastating, yes. Global consequences, definitely. But does it automatically equal the start of World War III?
What's the difference they're pointing to?
Scale, scope, the direct involvement of all the major global powers fighting each other across the globe. That's the argument, that significant regional conflicts, even with lots of international players involved indirectly, aren't inherently global wars in the way World War I or II were.
Okay, so the fire this time, as one source put it, doesn't automatically mean a worldwide inferno. What else might hold it back?
Well, geography for one. The main battlefields right now are still geographically limited, even if the impact is global.
Right.
And the weapons, while sophisticated, are still largely conventional in Ukraine. The massive total industrial mobilization we saw in the past world wars, we're not quite there yet.
And what about the ideology? You know, the democracy versus autocracy narrative we hear so much. Does that fit the old patterns?
It's there, definitely. Elements of ideological competition are certainly part of the mix, but you could argue the world today is actually more fragmented, more multipolar than it was during the Cold War, for instance.
Less clear-cut blocks.
Perhaps, yeah. The lines of allegiance, opposition,
Mm.
they seem more fluid, more complex, maybe.
That makes sense. And then there's the economy, our globally connected economy. That must act as some kind of brake, surely.
A huge one. That deep economic interdependence, especially with China, involves so heavily everywhere, it creates massive disincentives for a full-on global conflict.
The economic damage would just be catastrophic for everyone.
For everyone, arguably, that's a really powerful deterrent right there.
Okay, so thinking about the big players.
Yeah.
The U.S. is still generally seen as the top dog, right?
Yeah.
But the main competition is shifting.
That's the widely held view, yes. The U.S. remains this sort of preeminent global power, but its primary long-term strategic challenge is seen as China, mostly economic technological rivalry.
And fighting a global war against both China and Russia at the same time. That's hard to imagine.
Very hard to envision, according to most analysts. The resources, the logistics, it's an extremely challenging scenario. Why do you think that is?
Which kind of leads to a fascinating strategic question, doesn't it? If, hypothetically, the U.S. did get drawn into a major conflict with China, would Russia automatically jump in on China's side against the U.S.? Is that a given?
That's a huge uncertainty right now, a really crucial point. It's absolutely not a foregone conclusion.
Really?
Some analysts suggest Russia might actually see an opportunity there. Maybe stay neutral, maybe even benefit indirectly from the U.S. being heavily occupied elsewhere. The calculations are incredibly complex for everyone involved, highly contingent on the specifics.
So, wow. We've covered a lot of ground here, from some quite alarming predictions, government reports, expert surveys talking about a looming global conflict.
Right, those are pretty sobering.
To these more cautious takes, highlighting the limits, the complexities, the things that might actually prevent it.
Exactly. The sources we've looked at, they paint a really multifaceted picture. You've got these worrying trends, these potential triggers that, definitely demand attention.
But you've also got strong counter-arguments, factors like economic ties, the sheer difficulty of a multi-front global war, suggesting it's not necessarily inevitable, not in the near term anyway.
That's precisely. It's not a done deal.
So, as you, our listener, process all of this, here's maybe the key question to reflect on. Given all these different viewpoints, these warnings, and these counter-arguments, what specific factors do you think will ultimately be the most decisive? What will really shape the future of global security?
Yeah, what tips the balance?
Exactly. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring this. Do your own digging. Keep thinking critically about what this all means for the world we're heading into.